Okay, so this is Chapter 10 of Death and Disorder, A History of Modern England, 1485 to 1690 by Ken Macmillan. The chapter is entitled Elite and Common Culture. First section, Death and Disorder, the Sutton Witches. To explain misfortune in a superstitious society that lacked modern scientific knowledge, and to account for the strange or unwanted actions of those who operated outside of the orderly boundaries expected of their gender or rank, early modern communities often rallied together to accuse women of witchcraft. Indeed, among the ranks of disorderly women, none were more feared and reviled than those who entered into a pact with the devil to cause death and destruction among their neighbors. Usually, though not always, their accusers were men whose family experienced tragedies such as the loss of a wife, child, or livestock. As agricultural, economic, and demographic crises mounted in the late Elizabethan and early Stuart period, poor women in need of charity or widows who refused to remarry or sell their land found themselves especially vulnerable to accusation, prosecution, and execution. A harsh comment about male privilege or patriarchal church teachings, or the utterance of a curse or swear in the presence of witnesses, could also lead to this outcome. It did not help matters that James I styled himself an expert in the discovery of the dark arts and wrote the Demonology in 1597, which highlighted the disorder that witches wreaked on society. This viewpoint conformed to earlier English legislation against witchcraft passed in 1542 and 1563, and strongly informed the language of the frequently used Act Against Conjuration, Witchcraft, and Dealing with Evil and Wicked Spirits of 1604. The latter act led to a witchcraft craze in the 17th century, especially under the prosecution of Witchfinder General Matthew Hopkins during the height of the persecutions in the mid-1640s. In the standard narrative, witches forsook God and consorted with the devil, who entered into a convent written in the witches' own blood and suckled from them. This suckling was typically done by a, quote, familiar, end quote, often a cat, on a, quote, third nipple, end quote, a blemish that was commonly sought on the witch's body as proof of her consortium. Once the covenant had been consummated, the devil arranged vengeance on the witch's behalf. This was essential in demonstrating maleficium, or using witchcraft for evil deeds, which was an element that needed to be proven at trial to secure a conviction. Another key means of determining whether a woman was a witch was to subject her to a, quote, trial by water, end quote. This involved placing a rope around her waist or feet and thrusting her into the water. If she floated, she was guilty because it meant that God had rejected receiving the witch into the water, which was a symbol of baptism and a belief in Jesus Christ. If she sank, she was accepted by God and acquitted, in which case the rope was used to haul her out before she drowned. Other means of coercion, including a more severe forms of torture, could be used to secure a confession. These methods were employed when in 1612 Mother Sutton and her daughter Mary found themselves accused of witchcraft. See figure 10.1. Figure is testing the Sutton witches from witches apprehended, 1613. A poor widowed woman, Mother Sutton was given a job as the town hall-keeper as an act of charity. Although her charges often succumbed to miscarriages, quote, staggerings, frenzies, and other diseases, end quote, to the impoverishment of their owners, she was allowed to continue in these duties for 20 years. Her daughter Mary was held to be a lewd woman who had 3 bastard children, one of whom was her troublesome son, Henry. Neither of these failings in themselves was sufficient to warrant an accusation of witchcraft until Mother Sutton became an enemy of a gentleman, Master Enger. One day, after a heated argument, Mother Sutton vocally vowed revenge against Enger. Soon after, his horses were found dead in his stable, with no explanation as to the cause of their deaths. Next, Enger's hogs, often after eating meat served by Sutton, fell, quote, madly and violently ill, end quote. And dozens of them ran over a dam and drowned themselves, to Enger's considerable financial loss. On another occasion, as one of Enger's servants, while he had been discussing the Suttons with a friend, was struck on the breast with a beetle, which caused him to fall into a temporary trance. As he recovered at Enger's home, the servant claimed he saw Mary Sutton enter his room through a window. She sat at the end of his bed knitting, stared into his face, and eventually offered to go to bed with him so that his health could be restored. By, quote, divine assistance, end quote, the servant was able to repulse Mary and upbraid her for her abominable life before she departed back through the window. When Master Enger confronted Mary about the incident, she denied it and refused to meet with the servant to hear his tale, whereupon Enger violently placed Mary on horseback and brought her to his house. Forced to be at the servant's bedside, Mary allegedly touched the sick man's neck with her finger and departed, causing him to become violently ill. When Enger's 7-year-old son, who was well familiar with these events, saw Mother Sutton at the town mill, he flung stones at her and called her a witch. This prompted mother and daughter to call in their families 2 spirits named Dick and Jude, which suckled from marks on their thighs, while the women gave instructions for the torment of Enger's son. This torture soon resulted in his death. Quote, for his tender and unripe age was so enfeebled and made weak by the devilish infliction of extremity, as in 5 days, not able longer to endure them, death gave end to his perplexities. End quote. The boy's death was the last straw for Master Enger. He quickly gathered other men of the community, found Mary Sutton, beat her senseless with a cudgel, brought her to the dam, bound her thumbs and toes together, and threw her into the water where she floated. The women of the community then searched Mary's body for the devil's mark and discovered it on her left thigh. Mary and her mother were detained, bound for trial, where Enger and other members of the community testified to a long list of grievances against the Suttons. They were also betrayed by Mary's son, Henry, who exposed their plans to torment the boy and confessed to his mother's covenant with the devil's familiars. Both mother and daughter were convicted of witchcraft and executed the following day, probably by being hanged at the gallows, as this was the common punishment for witches unless they were also found guilty of petty treason. The Suttons fell perfectly into the stereotype of the vengeful witch. They were contentious and quarrelsome women, loose in tongues and morals, financial and social scourges on the community, and easy targets to explain misfortunes such as sickness and death, especially those of an elderly servant or an innocent child. Interestingly, it was not uncommon for women to confess to their consortium with the devil and to the various causes of maleficium they were accused of committing, often without any coercion or torture. This is possibly because many confessed and convicted witches were not in fact executed, although their trials and tribulations served the key purpose of restoring them to the boundaries of behavior demanded by an orderly society. It might also have been because the popular belief system at this time supported the existence of witches and the idea that unexplainable events had supernatural causes. Discussion question 10.1. The peak of witchcraft persecutions in English history occurred between about 1560 and 1650. Based on evidence provided in earlier chapters, what reasons might account for this? Elite culture. The wealth, privilege, and title of aristocrats in early modern England, roughly defined as those of gentlemen rank and above, meant that they often lived quite separate lives from commoners, or who were those of artisanal and yeoman rank and below. We must, however, be careful when making such a clear distinction. as there were various factors that also determined a person's lifestyle and culture, including whether they lived in the countryside or the towns, gender, age, and personal circumstances. In addition, the income and material wealth of elites varied considerably during this period, with the fortunes of noble and gentry families rising and falling based on the monarch's pleasure and willingness to bestow or revoke honors, investment strategies, and other unpredictable economic ventures, such as overseas trade, which could lead to enrichment or ruin, and when they lived during these complicated 2 centuries. Established noble families held thousands of acres of land and earned a considerable income from rents and fees associated with their titles, offices, monopolies, and royal grants. Their annual income averaged about £3,000, though some earned several times that much and some considerably less. In addition to their annual incomes, many noble families possessed thousands of pounds in material wealth due to generations of inheritances. These few noble families, numbering 40 to 60 between 1485 and 1690, usually owned 2 or more homes. One was a town house in London, or another large city that was used when Parliament was in session, when court protocol or their offices demanded their presence, or when business affairs so required. The other home was their country seat, or, quote, country house, end quote. This was usually a large, multi-winged, multi-storied home with a central courtyard and several outbuildings. The income of spiritual lords was less than that of their temporal counterparts, about £1,300 per year. The archbishops, however, typically made many times that amount from tithes, services provided to parishioners, and rent collected from tenants who lived on church land. They lived in elaborate palaces that were owned by the church and were put out at the bishop's disposal during their terms of episcopacy, usually for life, and they generally had less personal material wealth than the temporal nobility. The dozens of rooms in noble homes, whether country houses or bishops' palaces, included bedchambers with 4-poster beds, quote, stools and quote, quote, stool and quote, rooms, toilets, dining halls, entertainment parlors, chapels, beer and wine cellars, kitchens and pantries, and cold rooms. Gentlemen, baronets, knights, esquires, and untitled gentry and professionals, including physicians, lawyers, merchants, and wealthier clergymen, for example, possessed less land, ranging from a small plot in town to hundreds of acres in the country, and material wealth had smaller, though still generous, incomes, ranging from perhaps £150 to more than £1,000 per year from rents, fees, salaries, offices, or investments. Although this income was more modest than that of the average nobleman, yet greater than that of some poor lords, it was still enough to allow a gentleman to live in a townhouse or country house comprising 2 or 3 floors and many rooms. Although their incomes could vary quite a bit, nobles and gentlemen had sufficient resources to employ a dozen or more, and in some cases 100 or more servants. These might include stewards, valets, tutors, cooks, maids, footmen, grooms, kitchen boys, who provided for the needs of the lord and his family. Some of these were menial servants living in a garret, attic, or a separate wing of the house or in outbuildings, while others were retainers, who arrived at the home each morning and left each evening. Supplementing their ranks were large numbers of groundskeepers and field laborers who maintained the manor and common lands known as domain land. That was not rented to tenants. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that word domain right. It's Demesne. Aristocratic residences were used as places of business where affairs of the estate were managed, and also places of pleasure, such as during hunting season and holidays. Within these aristocratic homes, consistent with wealth of their patron, artists, craftsmen, and architects were employed to build ornate fireplaces, furniture, and woodwork. Elite families filled their homes with tapestries, porcelain, books, and artwork from throughout Europe, all as visible signs of their owners' wealth and status within society. This was particularly important when the monarch and his or her courtiers arrived during the annual progress through the countryside when the aristocrat was expected to offer exquisite food and entertainment that could cost thousands of pounds for a few days of activities. It was also not unusual for nobles and members of the gentry order to own a hunting cottage, which was usually more rustic and modest than their residences, and to lend it to members of the court or other aristocrats on occasion. The nobility and gentry were also able to dress the part. Clothing was immensely expensive, custom-fitted, and hand-tailored at this time, but the wealthiest people in society could purchase a wide range of apparel for different occasions. They could purchase silk, satin, and velvet cloth laced with gold and silver, lined with fur, and painstakingly embroidered. Men wore fine jackets, doublets, hose to show off their legs, garters, gloves, robes, ruffs, elaborate collars, purses, swords, and hats. Women wore thick gowns, bodices, close-fitting jackets, sleeves, and skirts which were pieced together with pins to allow their wardrobe to be mixed and matched and accessorized with jewelry and lace. Many of the materials for these various pieces of apparel were purchased from merchants who brought them from Persia or other parts of Europe. According to the sumptuary laws, some of these items of clothing could only be worn by individuals of certain ranks or who were earned at least £200 per year. This made aristocrats instantly visible in society and also ensured that those of lesser fortunes did not impoverish themselves and their families by dressing above their means. Although aristocrats were often required to carry out various administrative and occasionally military duties associated with their ranks, sitting in Parliament or as justices of the peace or Lord's Lieutenant, for example, there was also ample time to partake of leisure activities. Depending on the time of year, during the day, elites would engage in lawn bowling, shuttlecock, tennis, horse and dog racing, and hunting large game, deer, fowl, partridge, pheasant, and quail, and other animals such as rabbits and foxes. The Tudor recovery of chivalric games, often organized into competitive tournaments, served as forms of entertainment and exercise. The events included jousting, wrestling, sword fighting, and archery using the longbow, culminating in the naming of a tournament champion. Although most of these activities were once part of an aristocrat's preparation for military command, they had long since become defunct in battle, but were nonetheless considered necessary training for elite young men. In the evenings, aristocrats moved indoors for gambling, masks, music, reading, jesting, and playing board games such as chess, draughts, and backgammon. Many of these outdoor and indoor activities were attuned to male interests, but elite women also became involved as supporters and participants and had their own forms of cultural expression as well, such as fine needlework, letter writing, and paying visits to friends and acquaintances. The diet of elites also reflected their position in society. Wealthy people ate meat, venison, pork, beef, lamb, mutton, and poultry, seafood, especially during certain religious observances or, quote, fish days, end quote, and fine-milled white bread and fresh cheese daily. They drank copious amounts of spirits, wine, or, quote, sack, end quote, and beer, and often consumed fruit only in the form of sugary desserts such as pastries, puddings, and tarts. Elites also had the means to acquire and consume the various luxury products that increasingly became available as empire and trade expanded during the early modern period. Wine, olives, tobacco, sugar, coffee, chocolate, and spices from the Americas, Europe, Indonesia, and South Asia became regular dietary items. Often lacking in the elite diet were legumes and vegetables, in part because of the ready availability of other foodstuffs, and also because of the perception that root vegetables, turnips, carrots, radishes, and gourds were too base for elite palates because they grew too near the ground. As a result, elite diets were lacking in key vitamins and nutrients that often led to ailments such as gout, anemia, rickets, bladder stones, blindness, gum disease, and rotten teeth. Common culture. Some water. Excuse me. Gotta get some water. Like aristocrats, the ranks of commoners were varied in factors such as income, location, gender, inheritance, and reputation also dictated their lifestyle. Toward the top of the social scale of commoners, artisans, yeomen, lesser members of the clergy, and some lower-earning professionals, such as teachers and shopkeepers, might earn £40 to £80 per year. The income of artisans came from the products they created from their trade, which began after many years of hands-on training. Yeomen farmed their land, growing crops such as wheat, barley, rye, and oats, or they raised livestock, which was either let out in the morning to graze in common fields and herded back into pens at night, or in the case of poultry, kept in coops on the farm. This livestock was sheared for wool, sheep, fattened for slaughter. Cow, pigs, and chickens are raised for their byproducts, such as eggs and milk, which was turned into cheese and butter. In addition to their annual income, wealthy commoners might possess another £50 to £100 in chattel property, which they could pass on to their children as inheritances. Although the income of artisans and yeomen was not substantial, it was sufficient to permit land ownership of plaster and wood constructed homes. The famous, quote, Tudor-style, end quote, home was common among this rank, consisting of several rooms, 2 or 3 fireplaces, wooden floors, and some luxuries such as multiple sets of good clothes, some books, cupboards, pots and pans, pewter cutlery, linens, wooden tables, chairs, and beds with straw mattresses. These wealthier commoners could also afford to employ several servants to help in the home and around the farm. Meat of a lesser quality than the elites ate, boiled feet, knuckles, hocks, jowls, and bacon could be consumed on most days, which was supplemented with beer, wheat or rye bread, eggs, cheese, nuts, and fruit from their orchards, and leafy greens and root vegetables grown on a parcel of land set aside for the household's personal use. Barring the onset of disease or famine during lean years, wealthy commoners lived a comfortable lifestyle and ate a well-balanced diet similar to that with which we are familiar today. The situation was rather different for those lower on the social scale, who, according to Gregory King in his famous population study of the year 1688, composed some 60 to 70% of society. Cottagers who rented homes and farmed small parcels of land, and laborers who worked on somebody else's land lived in a small thatched straw or sod-covered plaster or wooden one or 2-room cottages with clay or dirt floors and a single fireplace dedicated to both heating and cooking. The entire family, including possibly a young female servant, slept on bundles of straw or hammocks around the fireplace, perhaps with curtains to protect the privacy of the master and mistress of the house. Farm animals, sheep or chickens, for example, sometimes also slept inside for warmth. The sleeping arrangements were gathering up and set aside during the day to allow for full use of the common space for other activities. Soldiers and sailors, who also composed this group, often did not have fixed places of residence and billeted at inns, barns, tented communities, or with other families when they were not at sea or on campaign, which is also true of itinerant journeymen, peddlers, performers, and seasonal field workers. With an annual income of perhaps £2 to £15, these commoners lived a subsistence lifestyle and possessed few things beyond a second set of poor quality, often homemade and frequently mended clothes, a small wooden table, a couple of benches, basic tools for cooking and cleaning, and perhaps a modest spinning wheel for piecework to help bring in extra money. Meat was a luxury few could afford, and the, quote, small beer and, quote, cheese, coarse bread prepared in communal ovens, foraged berries and porridges, stews and soups made from cereals or legumes produced in a tiny kitchen garden made up the bulk of their rather monotonous diet. When meat was available, this was usually internal organs, liver, kidney, and other parts of the animal that butchers could not sell to wealthier customers, which were chopped or ground and stuffed into sausage skins, or baked or boiled into savory pies and puddings. Commoners took part in entertainment that was sometimes more productive than that of wealthy elites. When they were not working in the fields, trades, or in the service, they might participate in plowing contests, which were competitive and enjoyable, but also resulted in a farmer's field being made ready for planting. They took part in barn raisings and quilting bees, in which the men spent the day building a barn and the women produced a quilt while their children played in the nearby fields or rivers. The entire community then assembled for meals, with each family contributing. Families went to market and fairs together to transact business, meet with neighbors, watch executions and shaming rituals, see traveling troops, and play games such as inter-village football contests. In the evening, men and sometimes women went to alehouses, where they sang ballads and bawdy songs, gambled on card, dice, cockfighting, and similarly rough activities, and listened to popular books being read by the semi-literate. Commoners played board games at the pub or at home before the daylight was lost. Candles and oil were a luxury, so darkness usually signaled that it was time to retire for the night. The common folk were also the primary participants during days of celebrations, which were surprisingly numerous in early modern England. Religious holidays included Twelfth Night and Epiphany, January, Candlemas and Valentine's Day, February, Lady Day, March 25th, the New Year, Easter, Michaelmas, September, All Saints' Day, November 1st, with the day before being All Hallows' Eve, Christmas and All Sundays. England also had several holidays related to the agricultural cycle, including Saturnalia, January 1st, May Day, Midsummer, June 21st, Harvest Day. Finally, there were several days of national memory, such as Coronation Day and the Royal Birthday, which changed for each monarch. St. George's Day, April 23rd, to celebrate England's patron saint, and days that celebrated the defeat of the Spanish Armada, July 29th. The Gunpowder Plot, November 5th, and Charles II's escape from parliamentary soldiers in 1651, Royal Oak Day, May 29th. These were all days in which, quote, bodily labor, end quote, was set aside and replaced with solemn worship or entertainment. These days of celebration were among the few occasions when elite and common culture combined. Elites celebrated with commoners, especially during religious observances, but they were more conservative and provided the means of celebration, such as food and drink. During these occasions, commoners celebrated loudly and liberally through dancing, bell-ringing, burning effigies, and enjoying whatever was given to them by the aristocrats. They could enjoy the spirits and wines, meat and fish, and pudding and pies that most were denied in their own homes. Especially on celebration days associated with pagan rituals, Saturnalia and May Day, elites often tolerated significant degrees of disorder, with the understanding that this provided a social safety valve, a way for the commoners to blow off steam and then return willingly and peacefully to a state of orderliness in which the great chain of being and the patriarchal deferential relationship was restored, until another occasion for revelry arrived. At the very bottom of the scale were the sturdy beggars, who earned no income beyond that which they could get from begging, which might provide an evening meal and a corner of a barn to spend the night in, sometimes in exchange for a day's labor. Otherwise, they slept under bridges or in hastily erected tents and lean-tos at the river edge or in common fields, scavenged for rags for clothing and scraps of food, went perpetually undernourished, and lived the bleakest of existences in early modern England, officially unrecognized even by the poorest of laborers. Among this lowly group were occasional bands of thieves who traveled the countryside, stole from the wealthy, and were much feared by propertied English people. See Voices of the Past, The Wealthy Yeoman and the Tragical Midwife. Discussion question 10.2. What problems are caused by the use of the term, quote, elite, end quote, common, end quote, or, quote, popular, end quote, to describe English culture at this time? Can you think of better terms? Art and literature. Following the reception of humanism in England in the early 16th century and the significant increase in the use of the printing press after about 1560, England achieved a tremendous outpouring of artistic and literary works that remain important to the present day. In artwork, painting was the primary medium, which involved artists, mostly foreign-born men invited to England, being patronized by monarchs and nobles to produce depictions of important religious scenes and also portraits of patrons and their families for posterity. Hans Holbein the Younger, 1497 to 1543, for example, produced portraits of Henry VIII, Desiderius, Erasmus, Thomas More, and his daughter Margaret, in addition to numerous other aristocrats, diplomats, and scholars. Nicholas Hillard and Isaac Oliver, Peter Paul Rubens, 1577 to 1641, and Anthony van Dyck, 1599 to 1641, produced many noble portraits, including well-known depictions of Elizabeth I and members of the early Stuart royal family, both in full scale and in miniature. These works were notable not only for their detail and realism, but also for their displays of mundane scenes and the natural world that reflected broader European approaches to Renaissance art. Naturally, the common orders rarely saw or had the opportunity to become part of this artistic culture. One sec. Just wanted to make sure I was still recording. Architecture also saw major advancements during this period and was likewise heavily influenced by the European Renaissance. Monarchs such as Henry VIII built or improved several key royal palaces, such as Hampton Court, which, first built by Cardinal Wolsey as a display of power, developed into a modern Renaissance palace. Although Henry's children were somewhat more parsimonious, James I employed the architect Inigo Jones, 1573 to 1652, to expand Whitehall Palace with the addition of banqueting house, which still stands, and to improve Greenwich's Queen's House. Wealthy aristocrats followed suit throughout the 16th and 17th centuries, which saw the erection of stone and brick edifices, such as Burleigh House, built by William Cecil, and other grand country houses. After the Great Fire of London in 1666, Christopher Wren, 1632 to 1723, was employed by Charles II to rebuild the city, such that his influence is still evident in dozens of domed churches, including St. Paul's Cathedral. As mentioned earlier, the elite also employed artists, architects, and craftsmen to create ornate marble and wood artifacts within their homes as visible signs of their wealth. Beginning in the Elizabethan era, England also saw the rise of the theatre, which was performed by men in London's playhouses, the courtyards and parlour rooms of monarchs and aristocrats, and in towns squared by several troupes. Christopher Marlowe's 1564 to 93, Dr. Faustus, was widely successful, as were the plays of Ben Jonson, 1572 to 1637, Thomas Dekker, 1572 to 1632, William Devenant, 1606 to 1668, and others. Chief among these playwrights, of course, was William Shakespeare, 1564 to 1616, who operated in the company of the Lord Chamberlain's men, and whose work was performed in the Globe Theatre and other locales. Shakespeare wrote a total of 37 plays, many still well known and performed today. They covered several genres, including histories, tragedies, and comedies, the latter often deeply allegorical and containing supernatural characters. The popularity of the theatre, which struggled during times of radical reformation and plague, was owed to its large multi-classed audience. Elites and commoners alike flocked to new productions, the former sitting on cushions around the covered outer edge within the theater, and the latter standing as, quote, groundlings, end quote, in the open space in the front of the stage. The theaters and parlor rooms of elites also showed the various forms of musical expression and dance in early modern England. Traditional choir songs and a cappella madrigals were supplemented with music performed on lutes, small stringed instruments, viols, early violins, virginals, and organs to accompany dancers at balls, emphasize dramatic moments on stage, and offer entertainment before the show and between acts. This period saw the rise of numerous composers such as Orlando Gibbons, 1583 to 1625, keyboardist in the Privy Chamber of Charles I and organist at Westminster Abbey, and Thomas Campion, 1567 to 1620, who wrote more than 100 songs for the lute and madrigal. In elite homes, theatrical and musical expression often came in the form of masks. many produced by Inigo Jones, which involved masqueraded players, often the wealthy themselves, dancing and performing for their friends and guests. Indeed, the ability to play music, dance, and perform was considered a sign of noble status and proper breeding, and a perfectly suitable evening pastime for England's elite. The plays of Shakespeare were first published by John Hemmings and Henry Condell in 1623, thus placing them into the canon of literature as well as theater. Their publication came during England's print revolution, which saw the production of many other important works of politics, religion, and poetry. Some of this literature has already been discussed throughout this book, such as Thomas More's Utopia, John Fox's Acts and Monuments, Edmund Spenser's The Faerie Queene, James I's True Law of Free Monarchies, and the King James Bible, Thomas Hobbes's Leviathan, Charles I's Icon Basilica, and John Locke's two treatises on government. All of these were important works that continue to be read today. To this list can also be added Desiderius Erasmus' Praise of Folly, Christopher Saxton's Atlas of the Counties of England and Wales, Richard Hakluyt's Principal Navigations, John Speed's Theatre of the Empire of Great Britain, Edward Coke's Institutes of the Laws of England, John Milton's Paradise Lost, the Proceedings of the Old Bailey, which provided details about London crime, and the poetry of Shakespeare, Robert Herrick, John Donne, Andrew Marvell, which often reflected the Carpe Diem theme discussed in the next chapter. These works were written by and for elite educated audiences who, as we have seen, could afford multi-volume expensive copies to have leather-bound imprinted with their coat of arms and added to their expanding libraries. In the late Elizabethan period, for example, John Dee's personal library was the largest in all of England, and Robert Cotton's library in the early Stuart age included a huge number of manuscripts. Both of their expansive collections still exist in major English archives and research libraries. From the 1580s, popular literature was published for semi-literates and even illiterate audiences who would have the work recited to them in pubs or town squares, pamphlets on various subjects, almanacs of use to farmers, broadsides advertising national news, and ballads written to be performed to a familiar tune all became common genres of literature during this period. This literature was typically sold by traveling peddlers to poor rural audiences and was consequently poorly printed, unbound, inexpensive, and disposable, likely turned into pie plate liners, pipe starters, and, quote, bum paper, end quote, soon after their consumption. Their themes were less overtly political or ideological than elite literature and focused on topics such as satire, astrology, witchcraft, crime, mocking wives, cuckolded husbands, ribaldry, and scatology. Straddling elite and popular literature are the various conduct books discussed in Chapter 9, William Perkins, An Exhortation Concerning Good Order and Obedience to Rulers and Magistrates, and William Stubbs' Crystal Glass for Christian Women, for example, appealed to both elite and common audiences because both were involved in maintaining the patriarchal and differential order. Discussion question 10.3. Based on discussions in earlier chapters, what conditions existed in England that allowed or encouraged such a high degree of artistic and literary expression? Popular belief systems. As you have seen in the previous chapters, the people of early modern England were devoutly religious and believed in a literal interpretation of the Bible. They accepted on faith and were taught by the church that God and the devil were providential beings who were directly involved in human affairs. That prayer could bring about tangible outcomes, health, prosperity, good harvests, and healthy children, for example, and that ordained churchmen had special capacities that enabled them to answer complex moral questions, a practice known as casuistry. The devil, it was believed, acted to thwart God's laws and man's free will, often working through witches, such as the Suttons discussed earlier. Elites and commoners alike also believed that there was much that was unknown about the world, and that mankind's ignorance was part of God's plan. This is why the popular belief system was commonly referred to as a branch of, quote, natural philosophy, end quote, rather than science. In the absence of more advanced scientific knowledge, the ability to explain misfortunes and the unknown unknown usually involved resorting to explanations that lean toward magic, the supernatural, and the common early modern quest for order and balance in all things. Especially in the 16th century, many accepted the notion of the, quote, corresponding planes, end quote, of the macrocosm and the microcosm. Such planes included, for example, the superlunary and sublunary spheres, that which was above the moon, the cosmos, and that which was below the moon, earth. Heaven and earth, angels and man, the spiritual and the physical, and several others. In theory, the macrocosm was always more perfect, and thus the ability to understand and commune with the macrocosm could help to explain the microcosm and bring it to greater perfection. The people who communed with the macrocosm were known as magi, or, quote, cunning, end quote, men and women who professed the ability to understand and manipulate the natural world. Cunning people were highly valued among members of Tudor society because they could offer answers when the contemporary limitations of science failed to do so. For a small sum of money, they could ward off evil, discover lost or stolen property, divine for water, predict the weather, conjure dead spirits, make aphrodisiacs, interpret portents, omens, signals, and dreams, to offer warnings or predictions, and promote health and healing. Regarding the latter, they used practices such as encouraging the sick to eat eggs boiled in their own urine, burning contaminated clothing, placing herbs or charms on doors or windowsills, reading palms, palmistry, and heads, physiognomy, giving blessings and reciting chants and invocations, magic spells. Most of these methods were harmless, and positive outcomes were more likely related to giving the body time to heal, good detective work, or life experience, but their misapplications, such as the uttering of a curse or an unexpected outcome from a seemingly overt act of magic, could lead to accusations of witchcraft against cunning practitioners. Although there were hundreds of magi in early modern England, perhaps the most famous of them was John Dee, Queen Elizabeth's court magician, who straddled the world of magic and emerging notions of science. Drawing on classical thinkers such as Aristotle, Plato, Ptolemy, Pythagoras, and using techniques such as geometry, astrology, alchemy, and theurgy. This is divine magic used by cunning people as opposed to, quote, black magic, end quote, used by witches and others who had evil intent. Dee communed with the macrocosm to explain the microcosm. To do so, he relied on various tools such as scrying stones, black mirrors and crystal balls, and mathematical tables and charts, methods that he learned from another famous magus and con man, Edward Kelly. A vastly learned Renaissance polymath, we have already seen his contributions to English exploration. Dee used astrology, for example, to determine the best date for Elizabeth's coronation in order to ensure a long and happy rule. Dee and Kelly also recorded numerous enigmatic conversations with angels, which provided guidance on understanding and perfecting man and the natural world. As the Protestant Reformation wore on in the Tudor age, activities such as sorcery, enchanting, and invocations, particularly those not endorsed by the clergy, were explicitly forbidden by parliamentary legislation, signaling what Keith Thomas has referred to as the, quote, decline of magic, end quote, and also the rise of witchcraft prosecution. Nonetheless, as Dee's participation testifies, these forms of popular belief continued to be accepted, and not only among the poor and educated. Even in the post-Reformation world, with certain magical elements such as the veneration of icons and transubstantiation were dismissed by the English Church as excessively superstitious, elites and commoners continued to accept as fact the existence of ghosts, fairies, demons, and witches. The ghost in Shakespeare's Hamlet and the fairies in A Midsummer Night's Dream were perfectly believable to contemporary audiences. This society also accepted the king's ability to heal scrofula, a form of tuberculosis, by his mere touch. Magistrates often brought suspected killers into the presence of their victims to see if the corpse would accuse its murderer through spontaneous bleeding, a practice known as cruentation. As these examples demonstrate, despite certain religious teachings and state interventions, many English people remained highly superstitious and accepted supernatural causation when faced with the unknown. A related popular belief, also emerging from the recovery of classical ideas during the rise of humanism, was that the universe was interrelated and balanced, or organic, and that all matter consisted of 5 elements: earth, water, air, fire, and ether, in proper proportion according to its properties. This belief, supported by the Church, upheld Ptolemy's geocentric universe, in which the earth, consisting primarily of the heavy elements of earth and water, was in a fixed central position in the universe, around which all other celestial spheres, planets, the sun, and heaven revolved, in the perfect orderliness expected of their superlunary macrocosmic position. Galen's medical theory of humorism, in which the body consisted of 4 elements: blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm, was also based on the idea of balance and order. Humors were supposed to exist in proper proportions within the liver, gallbladder, spleen, and lungs. Illness, disease, and temperament, sanguine, choleric, melancholic, and phlegmatic, were believed to be the result of an imbalance that could be cured through treatments such as sweating, purging, bloodletting, leeching, and the application of salves and poultices designed to draw toxins from the body. Ben Jonson's plays Every Man in His Humor, 1598, and the lesser-known Every Man Out of His Humor, 1599, are based on the idea that the humoral theory determined an individual's temperament. It is perhaps little wonder that Tudor physicians were incapable of dealing effectively with outbreaks of plague, forcing people to turn instead to cunning men such as Dee. Despite numerous scientific advancements, these popular beliefs survived well into the 17th century. Scientific advancements. Let me get a drink here. By the mid-Elizabethan period, elements of the scientific revolution began to be seen in England and offered, if not a completely new understanding of the world, some competing ideas. For example, Henry Billingsley, with the help of Dee, Thomas Digges, and Robert Record, produced major works on geometry and mathematics. In Prognostication Everlasting, 1576, Digges supported Nicholas Copernicus's controversial and as of that time unproven theory of heliocentrism, the belief that the Earth revolved around the Sun, which was in a fixed position in the universe. In The Jewel House, 1594, Hugh Platt argued that inquiry into nature must be grounded in practice and experience, an early articulation of scientific method. Another leading advocate of changes to the scientific method was Francis Bacon. In Gesta Graeorum, 1594, Bacon proposed the building of a scientific institution founded on principles of rationality. Bacon further developed this notion in his utopian adventure, New Atlantis, published posthumously in 1627, which describes an institution, Solomon's House, dedicated to the scientific understanding of nature. Bacon also wrote Novum Organum Scientiarum, New Instrument of Science, 1620, in which he criticized the older methods of syllogistic logic developed by Aristotle and advocated by Neoplatonists, and instead argued for the use of inductive reasoning, a form of empiricism grounded in observation and experimentation. The practice is now known as the, quote, Baconian method, end quote. Supported by Bacon's method, the 17th century also saw major advancements in astronomy, chemistry, medicine, and physics. Robert Hooke, 1635 to 1703, and Edmund Halley, 1656 to 1742, invented various techniques using a telescope and learned how to predict phenomena such as solar eclipses and the paths of comets. The commissioning of the Royal Observatory in 1675 provided additional support for these efforts. Robert Boyle, 1627 to 1691, proposed that there were numerous elements in nature rather than the Aristotelian belief that there were only 5, and used the scientific method to discover the laws of gas and pressure. Similarly, William Harvey, 1578-1657, discovered the circulation of blood and included numerous drawings in his Exercitatio Anatomica, 1628, that came into direct conflict with Galen's humoral theory and initiated a wave of new medical literature and the beginnings of dissection of corpses. Harvey was also highly skeptical of the existence of witchcraft, and his involvement in a 1634 trial resulted in the acquittal of 4 women and helped lead to the decline of witchcraft, notwithstanding a brief powerful resurgence in the 1640s. The most important early modern English advancement in the scientific revolution are to be found in the work of Isaac Newton, 1643 to 1727, and John Locke, 1632 to 1704. Newton conducted experiments and discovered the laws of motion and gravity, which were published in his Principia Mathematica, 1687, giving rise to modern physics. One of the major implications of Newton's discoveries was that the universe worked according to fixed and undiscoverable laws, and therefore, while God was responsible for creating the world and setting it in motion, it therefore worked like a perpetual wound patch in predictable orderliness. This challenged the Church's teaching about God's providence, the efficacy of prayer, and the literal interpretation of the Bible. Newton was also a central figure and later president of the Royal Society, a scientific institution established by Charles II in 1660 along the lines of Bacon's proposals. Boyle, Hooke, and other leading members of the scientific revolution were also members of the Society. Locke, who, as we have seen, was also the author of the 2 treatises on government, contributed to a different branch of inquiry and became a founder of modern social sciences. In particular, in Essay Concerning Human Understanding in 1690 and the Thoughts Concerning Education in 1693, Locke speculated that humans were born with a tabula rasa, an empty mind, and did not possess innate knowledge. Instead, their knowledge was determined by their experiences, exemplified especially by their education, as might be imagined in a society that believed aristocrats and gentlemen were natural leaders of men because of their inborn capacity to govern. Locke's notion that all people were born equal in knowledge and that nurture rather than nature determined their abilities was met with resistance. This notion became, however, along with Newton's concept of the, quote, watchmaker god, end quote, leading tenets of the 18th century European Enlightenment. Partly because most of the participants of the scientific revolution were members of a highly elite group of intellectuals centered at the universities and in learned societies, it took some time for their various lessons to be known and accepted by the popular masses. The point at which older ideas of natural philosophy gave way to newer ideas associated with the scientific revolution was about the middle of the 17th century. Although some older notions, such as astrology, remained in use for long afterwards, this beginning of England's, quote, Age of Enlightenment, end quote, corresponds closely and not coincidentally with the significant decline of witchcraft persecutions in England after 1650, although they continued in smaller remote communities until the end of the century. By 1690, England had emerged as a global leader in scientific thought, and most earlier ideas associated with natural philosophy and supernatural causation had witnessed a substantial decline. Discussion question 10.4. Why do you think that popular belief in the supernatural could exist simultaneously with the rise of more advanced scientific knowledge? Voices of the past. The wealthy yeoman and the tragical midwife. Although most people in England were poor and had little worth stealing, perhaps 20% of families possessed enough wealth that they became targets for certain criminal elements within society. The following extract recounts that a hard-working husband and father, his loving wife, and their 2 children were assaulted by a band of thieves in their own home. After murdering the couple, the gang's leader, a, quote, beastly, end quote, woman, and, quote, tragical midwife, end quote, took the 2 children, and although the extract does not recount this part of the story, arranged for them to be murdered by an innkeeper and her son. With the active assistance of God, the girl survived, even though her tongue had been cut out. She managed to avenge her brother's murder by bringing his killers to justice. The gang, however, remained at large, a reminder to early modern readers of the dangers that surrounded them. For some 4 years since, near Davonshieh, 100 in Essex, lived a yeoman, one Anthony James, who in repute of the world was counted rich, and by the report of his neighbors held credible and honest. This man, in the desire of his youth, matched himself to an honest country maid, whose virtuous disposition equaled his own thoughts, and whose diligent care was carefully to save what her husband brought home, as his labor did strive to procure it abroad, so that the providence of the one and the care of the other mixed such a mutual content between them, that they lived like Abraham and Sarah, he loving to her, and she obedient to him. In process of time, this couple, growing wealthy by their labor, proved to be as happy by their issue, for it pleased God to enrich them with 2 children, a boy and a girl, that the wishes of the father might be as well satisfied as the desire of the mother, and both contended in so comfortable a blessing. Both contented in so wonderful a blessing. Jesus Christ. Both contented in so comfortable a blessing. Jesus Christ. The mother being, as women used to say, stored fish with a daughter, and called it by her own name, Elizabeth James, so that when time brought the father as happy rejoicing of a son, he christened it by his own name, Anthony James. In the education and bringing up of these 2 children, there was a pretty loving contention between the goodman and the wife, which of the 2 should prove most happy to the parents' delight, whose love indeed was alike to them both. So that time passing away in that comfortable strife between this loving couple, the daughter had attained to the age of 8 years and the son to 7, in which passage the mother, having no other issue, was then with child with the third, and the better half of her time had carried so happy a burden. About that season of the year a fair happened in Essex, to which the servants they then kept, some for pleasure, the rest for necessary business, were sent, so that the honest yeoman and his wife and children were only left at home when mischief, like a bramble that takes hold on whatsoever it touches, caught this occasion and wrought in the minds of 9, I cannot call them men, but villains, and another, not a woman, but a beast, to make a prey of these harmless 4 and their increased possessions. So these wretches, having fastened on this monstrous intent, made haste to the execution thereof, and so soon had attained to this wealthy yeoman's house, where, finding little or no resistance, they first bound the man and the woman, and giving the 2 children to 2 of their associates to hold, the rest fell to ransack, were not contenting themselves with that store of riches they found, as gold, silver, plate, rings, and other wealth, having made up their pack. They consulted with themselves for their further security to make spoil of the owners. It was not long in question ere, I think heirs means before. It was not long in question before this hellish jury had given up as damnable a verdict. For suspicion always haunting a guilty mind, they determined with themselves they could not be safe from pursuit, from attachment, nay, from shameful death, which they worthily deserved, without the slaughter of the father and the mother, which they presently resolved upon. And then 2 of them, stepping to the man, where they lay bounded upon the ground, with their daggers stabbed him in the body, who, ere before his speech left him, lifting up his eyes, begged only this of them, quote, take my riches, I care for them to bring up my posterity. But now they are yours, I give them you freely, then pity my wife, be merciful to my children, end quote. These, his last words, seemed to beget some remorse seldom seen in the men which were murderers, which the more than monstrous woman, perceiving as in a rage thereat, stepped to his wife, and calling to him with these words, talkest thou of pity? Quoth she, quote, if thy eyes have yet left so much sight to be witness, how I'll be pitiful. Behold how I'll perform thy petition, end quote. So drawing out her knife, O act too terrible to report, but the most damnablest that ever was heard of executed by a woman, she ripped her up the belly, making herself a tragical midwife, or truly a murderess, that brought an abortive babe to the world, and murdered the mother. The good woman having not leave to cry, and her husband having not use of speech, they both lift up their hands, roll their eyes one to another, and with that said but silent farewell ever. This tragical spectacle forced all the rest partakers in the robbery and actors in the murder to remorse, nay, even to a repentance. That done, this horrible action had a beginning. But sin always seeking securely to shroud itself in, they began now to question of their safety, and as villains are ever one afraid and in distrust of another, they conclude now to share their purchase in every knave to shift for himself. Some argued, quote, "Let us first kill the children as we have done their parents," end quote. Others, and the greater part, glutted with the present object and even ashamed of themselves and their sinful actions, not only denied but confidently resolved that they would be no further guilty in the blood of innocents. In brief, they agreed every party to have an equal portion of this ill-purchased booty, which soon shared amongst them, and as it appeared, having more than they could tell what to do withal, they gave the remains to 3 of their consorts, of which the woman was one to convey away the children from thence, and bestow them in what place soever, while they would give their parents burial. Source: Anonymous. The most cruel and bloody murder committed by an innkeeper's wife and her son. Discussion question 10.5. What does this tale and the specific language used by the author tell you about English society's obsessions with order and fear of disorder?